like stalked a little bit. my swim fan over there. So all of my, I think most of you guys are my students, so this is good for you all to hear this because I'd be doing this in class anyway. So it's nice for you to get this election and kind of debriefing in a more laid-back way. I enjoyed the last Times and Issues forum we had where they just kind of sat here and said, what questions do you have, and we could talk about it. But let me give us a little bit of a foundation. And I guess I have a question to answer, okay? And I will tell you what my answer is to whether the Tea Party mattered. What's fun about the day after election? So here's our statewide newspaper. Here's our local newspaper. And here's our national newspaper. We do not have the Trib on campus. I get the Trib at home because, you know, you can never have too many newspapers come to your house daily, so that's why I have so many. And they all have the same thing. It's all about Election Day. So what's kind of neat about Election Day in our media coverage is it provides a focusing point for everybody. So the agenda is set. Yesterday, everyone's talking about the election. I was up late last night watching it. I'm sure all of you were as well, to see what the returns were going to be. The differences are, you know, kind of little. On the national paper, you're going to see the GOP shows strong House gains, which is a rebuke for Obama, and then they've got Cuomo wins, because it's a New York paper as well as a national paper. Cuomo was the Democratic candidate in the state of New York. We've got this sad picture of Nancy Pelosi, because she's no longer going to be Speaker of the House. And our statewide, we have our statewide offices, right? So we've got Governor Herbert winning, and we've got Tea Party's Lee heading to D.C. This is the state Senate race for Bob Bennett's seat. Lee was able to bounce Bennett in the convention, and so he's running here kind of like it's an open seat. And then we've got our local coverage, which leads again with our governor, but then has more local news. The Top of Utah page, of course, has what's happening in the districts that matter mostly to Weber and Davis, right? And also has my students, beautifully above the fold, doing exit polling and being attacked by a knife-wielding, hooligan. But what we like about this is that the media is covering the elections. And there's really nothing else to talk about today but the elections. And the media does a good job of giving you every possible source of information you ever would need. I have been online all morning kind of checking numbers. As of this, we didn't know a number of states in the West because New York goes to press almost 5 seconds after Alaska's polls close, right? I mean, the western states close while New York State is getting ready to get up in the morning, right? So we didn't know Nevada. We now do. Nevada, Harry Reid won by like 6 points, so that was interesting. Colorado, the Democrat won, so pretty much the Democrats are going to hold the Senate even if Lieberman and Sanders decided not to be Democrat, which they're going to be Democrats, so that wasn't really a concern, but they've got it. The Democrats hold the Senate. We're waiting on Alaska. The write-in candidate has 41%, but we don't know who that is. I mean, we're pretty sure it's Murkowski. Does that make sense? But now what we have to do, write-in's got 41%. Joe Miller has 33%. We need to count. People have to read all those ballots, so we're going to wait and see. The thing about that is it has to be spelled correctly, so that's an interesting conversation as well to see if they're able to get Murkowski spelled correctly. Otherwise, those ballots won't count. So we're waiting on that. And I believe we're also waiting on Washington. I had a meeting right before I walked over here, so I didn't see the Washington results. When I left my office at 10:45, we were still waiting on Washington. But, you know, there's some interesting things going on. I think to answer the question that Javier said was the title of my talk, which was, does the Tea Party matter? My answer is going to be a qualified no, which means I think I need to figure out that answer, and I'll explain that. The Tea Party identifiers, when we ask them who they are white, wealthy, educated, which looks just like Republican identifiers who are white, wealthy, and educated. They also tend to be older. When you ask for ideology in yesterday's exit poll, 41% said they were conservative and 40% said they approved of the Tea Party. I'm a little unclear if those are different people. In fact, I would probably argue they're not. So I'm a little unclear that the Tea Party isn't just another name for conservative, and I'm interested in that. The question that I have, did the Tea Party matter? I think it mattered in nomination cycles, okay? So when the Salt Lake Tribune says Tea Party's Lee is heading to D.C., the bigger story is that the Tea Party bounced a sitting incumbent in the convention. Lee's going to go to D.C. He's a Republican in Utah. That's not the Tea Party sending someone to D.C. That's Utah sending yet another Republican to D.C., which is what we do all the time. So I think the question that I have, or that I need to find out to answer the question whether the Tea Party matters, is something that my husband gave me as a baseball statistic, so I'm stealing from him. That apparently in baseball, what they do for players is they'll say, you know, the Yankees are going to win 60 games. If they hire A-Rod, how many games will they win over that 60? Does that make sense? So the Yankees are going to get 60 anyway. If A-Rod comes to the team and they're still winning 60, then A-Rod actually has a benefit of 0. Do you know what I'm saying? If we now win 56, then A-Rod actually dinged us 4 games. So what I want to know about the Tea Party is, you know, their net gain or loss. Did they lose Delaware? Probably. Did they cost the Republicans Nevada? Probably. Did they cost the New York governorship? Probably not, okay, so that doesn't really matter. Did they win Utah, the Republican seat? The answer is absolutely not. The Republican was going to go. So what I need to figure out to answer that question is, which Republicans were going to win anyway? Does that make sense? And so those Tea Party candidates, that's a net of nothing, right, because those Republicans were going to go. Which Republicans should have won, except they were a Tea Party candidate? That's a minus. And then which candidates actually are Tea Party candidates where the Democrat lost because of this neat momentum from the Tea Party? And I haven't seen any data to help me figure that out yet. Does that make sense? So I'm going to take a look at, first you have to figure out who these guys are. The New York Times last week had that there were 138 Tea Party candidates that they had identified. The MSNBC last night had a bigger number than that. They were reporting that 35 Tea Party candidates had won, 54 candidates had lost. At the time that I fell asleep, 64 Tea Party candidates we didn't know about, which is more than 138. You know, so I got to figure out kind of who they are. Is Rand Paul a Tea Party candidate? The answer is yes, but he runs as a Republican in Kentucky, and I'm not sure Kentucky sends a Democrat. Anyway, do you see what I'm trying to say? So we got to kind of figure out who they are, and then whether they actually helped the party win. The pundits last night on the news were saying they feel that the Tea Party lost the Republicans the Senate. And that's an interesting question. I'm not sure of that answer. We'd have to take a look to see what's going on based on what I just kind of told you. I got to kind of find, you know, disaggregate this, pull away the Republican from the Tea Party variable to see what's happening. Any questions? I'll just kind of open it up from there. There's my answer to whether the Tea Party matters. I don't know. I don't think so. Okay, but I don't know. That's a question. Yeah.
This doesn't really have to do anything with the Tea Party. I don't know too much about it, but I read this morning on the New York Times that the Republicans swung more for the Republicans than for the Democrats. Why do you think that was?
That the Republicans swung more for the Republicans than the Democrats?
It seemed like the Republicans a lot more people voted for the Republicans this time than
Sure. So here's the answer to that question. It is actually who turned out to vote. So when we look at the exit poll and we say who showed up for this election, 78% of the people who voted were white. 41% of them were conservative. That's the biggest number we've seen in self-reporting ideology for conservative. So the answer is, why were they swinging Republican? Because those are the people who vote for Republicans. Does that make sense? When we take a look at who showed up to vote, the people who showed up to vote are people who are more likely to vote for Republican anyway. The interesting numbers there, men went 55 to 43 Republican. That's not a surprise, right? Men vote for Republicans. Females, women, 50 to 48 Democrat. So there's no gender gap. Usually we would expect women to have a bigger percentage for Democrat, and it was actually 2 points, only 2 points Democrat. When we look at white women, it's 57 to 41 Republican. So it's the race and the gender and that particular block that's making that interesting, resulting in the Republicans. When we talk about age group, every group that voted, other than white people, the majority went Democratic, but again, 78% were white. Does that make sense? So of the 22 that were not white, the Democrats won them. For age, the 18 to 29-year-olds went to the Democrats, but they were only 11% of the voting population. Does that make sense? So young people didn't show up. What I thought was interesting, 97% of people who voted yesterday had voted before. So we have no new voters. Does that make sense? We were really mobilizing. Nobody knew. Everyone was from before. And when you break the age down, basically people under 40 go to Democrat, people over 40 go to Republican, and old people vote more, right? So part of the reason why we explain that is as well. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question? Yeah. I don't know the national voter turnout. I've been looking for it. I find it in different states. Texas was like 33%. You know, so there's different states that I can find the turnout, but I haven't seen a national number yet to tell you that the whole country, this is the percentage that showed up to vote.
What was Utah?
I couldn't find it, so I don't know that answer. Does anyone know? Someone else may know.
Yesterday on the cover of USA Today, they had a breakdown, but that, I'm assuming that was for the last election. It was 22% was the younger.
Right, for the 2008 election, yeah. So the thing for Obama, and then if you think about this as a mandate on Obama, which I'm not sure it is, okay? If you think Obama mobilized groups that didn't turn out this time. Does that make sense? So youth didn't turn out as much, blacks didn't turn out as much, and so the groups that I guess are anti-Obama were the groups that turned out more. But my response to that is the groups that turned out were Republicans. So to a certain extent, it's more party ID than it is, I think, Obama. But anything else? Okay, I could just keep talking at you if you want me to. Go ahead.
Let me ask you about this argument that observers are making about this swing.
Yeah.
That we keep swinging back and forth, particularly at these midterm elections.
Sure.
Would you comment about that?
Sure. So the question here is whether this is another. I guess they've been calling it a hurricane. It's the hurricane of Republicans. I hate the media. I hate the media when they do stuff like that. When they just call it this stuff. So the answer about midterms is this. It is always the case, except for anomalies like 2002 where you have 9/11 in play, that the president's party is going to lose in the midterm. It's not always the case that he loses this big. So the Republicans gained more seats, and we haven't seen this many seat changes since 1948. So to a certain extent, that's 62 years. There's a big gap there. What's interesting about the swinging back and forth, so they're calling it, this is a change election, 08 was a change election, 06 was a change election. When we take a look at that historically, I was grabbing these numbers today so I could tell you, that makes us look kind of like we looked after World War I and after World War II, where we were flipping back and forth. So actually, and if you think about those times, we have economic downturn, we have war, we have social unrest. So actually, to a certain extent, we don't even look that new. Does that make, or different? We look kind of like we have historically. Only 3 times since World War I have either the Democrats or the Republicans won 20 or more House seats in 3 consecutive cycles. So it's always, it's not the case that we keep, kind of building. We always kind of have incremental shifts. And like I just said, we look like we did after World War I and after World War II. So I've been comparing it to 1994. And I think when you watch what's happening, in 1994, the Democrats committed suicide the next day, and Republicans were partying for 2 weeks, wherever it was that they were partying. You don't see that now. Boehner's first comment was, Obama sets the agenda. Newt Gingrich said, we're going to run the table. Do you remember? The difference here is Republicans felt very powerful after the 94 elections, and they're not in that position today. The other interesting thing, too, is in 94, I think it's a much more impressive gain for the Republicans because times weren't as bad. My question kind of is the Republicans should have done much better. Does that make sense, considering how bad the economy is, how, we've got numbers of 63% of Americans are not happy with the way the country is going. These kind of numbers should have led to the Senate being, wholesale turning over, and we don't see that. So to a certain extent, I think it's more a little shift than it is the hurricane that the media is calling it.
I appreciate that historical perspective.
Did you appreciate that, Dr. McKay? Okay. And I always try to do that because I hear from students all the time, right? We're so polarized, and the answer is, go back in history, and we're nuts all over the place, right? There are times in history when we are just as, if not more, polarized. We just don't have internet telling us every 5 minutes how polarized we are in those times. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Don't you think the flipping back and forth we've had congressional power in the last more of an indication, at least it is for me, I'm sick of all of it.
Okay.
I don't much care who's in power. I want them to start working with the other side, whoever you are. And to me, that's what this election showed, is that the Americans, there was one poll that showed 53% disapprove of the Democrats, and 53% disapprove of the
Yeah, their disapproval, their unfavorables are the same.
All of them, and
right.
If they couldn't get along, okay, no, we'll shift them this way.
Right.
We're still expecting to get along. This is nobody's mandate.
Right. And what's interesting, too, is they polled after the election, they're polling on Do you think the GOP will actually deliver? And the answer is no. So most Americans say we're voting for them and we expect them to fail. You know, it's kind of like, you know, we expect them not to do the job. I think it's interesting that you bring that up. I think what happens is we want them all to work together as long as they're working together the way that we want them to. So bipartisanship for Republicans is when Democrats do what Republicans want, and bipartisanship for Democrats is when Republicans do, okay? If you go back 40 years, we have a lot of what we call bipartisanship. But the reason it's bipartisan is because Southerners thought they were Democrats.
Yeah.
Okay, so they were super conservative, wearing the cape, you know, but they happened to be Democrat because Lincoln was a Republican. By the way, South Carolina, first time since Reconstruction, just voted for a Republican. So to give you an idea about how interesting the South is, what? And a black Republican since the Reconstruction. To give you an idea of how interesting the South is, that's, you know, they take a long time to change. So when you go back 40 years and you see Democrats, it's called the conservative coalition, but then you look at the numbers, they look like they're not polarized. But the answer is, of course they are. It's just that half of the party wasn't where it was supposed to be. Does that make sense? The South is now realigned probably appropriately to where it's supposed to be at the Republican, and so you get polarization. And I read it as a country that is very committed to its particular politics and is concerned or convinced the other side is wrong. I read it as a country where you've got thirds, right? A third of the people are claiming they're independent. I'm not sure how much I buy that. When we look at some polling, we really only have 10% pure independents. Usually that 30%, they lean. Do you know what I'm saying? We actually see them acting just like partisans when you ask them how they're voting. But you've got them claiming they're independent, and they're out there and they're swing voters. But the point is you've got half the country convinced they're right, the other half the country is convinced they're right, and so they don't get along. And quite frankly, you don't want them to. Because you want them advocating for your position, don't you? I mean, to a certain extent, right? So, especially when we think about Congress, there's a lot of literature about how Congress is public enemy number one because they fight so much. And Americans will say things like, don't fight, at the same time that they say, represent me exactly the way that I think, but I don't agree with everyone around me. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's kind of, I think that's more to it than it is. So I think Americans read it as I'm fed up with everybody, but really who they're fed up with is the other side blocking their policy positions. Yeah. Yeah.
In your opinion, what's the biggest reason for voter apathy in midterm elections? Is it just the frustration that voters have, or is it that the parties are mobilizing their voter base?
Sure. I think neither of those answers are the right answer. So what happens for midterm elections is, well, what we know about voter turnout. The things that predict voter turnout being high are things like competitive elections. So part of the reason why Utah has dropped to the bottom 3 states in the union over the last 20 years is because why show up? Right? Republicans are going to win, so what's the point? When you think about congressional elections, none of these races are really competitive. Do you know what I'm saying? So we're talking about this hurricane, and it really only is, there were really only about 100 states that were interesting to begin with, and as we got closer to the election, that dropped down to about below 40%. The incumbency rate for Congress is about 90%, and that's a blowout year. You know, usually it's 98% when they're not having a blowout. So, and I haven't seen the incumbency rates yet for today, okay? So I don't, because there are a lot of races still deciding, so I got to let you know that answer. But I bet it doesn't dip below 85, so they're getting a beat, right? Incumbents always win. So why am I going to vote? Do you see what I'm trying to say? Why show up when Bishop's going to win? It doesn't matter, right? So the midterm elections suffer from a non-competitiveness in many places. Secondly, voter turnout goes up when there's media attention when it's considered a sexy election. The presidential elections, we get higher turnout because they're sexier. Does that make sense? Everyone in the country is talking about Obama. And everyone in the country is talking about Obama today, but he's not on the ballot. Do you know what I'm saying? So I'm going out to vote for Bishop. I'm not really going out to vote for Obama. And so what's the point? And you kind of see voter turnout doing that. It's an interesting question you raise about party mobilization. What we know is if the parties do their job, they do get people out to vote. For voter turnout is affected by party mobilization. But I'm not really sure on the get out the vote efforts this year whether we can blame them or not. Democrats knew they had to get people out to vote. My understanding is they tried in those races, you know what I'm saying? So I'm not sure that we can blame mobilization because I think they did it and they failed. Does that make sense? And I'm not sure that Republicans, You know, that's a question about the Tea Party, whether they mobilized voters. But again, those voters were showing up anyway. Does that make sense? So I'm not really sure. They may have mobilized money. What we know about out-of-party expenditures is Republican candidates got, like, I think 2 to 1 or maybe 3 to 1 dollars over Democrats. Even though candidates were raising head-to-head, the out-of-party expenditures were much more for the Republican and very negative. So things like that, maybe the Tea Party is affecting, but it doesn't explain voter turnout all that much, I don't think. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about, we talked about whether there's a mandate in voter turnout. I wonder, with these swings that we're starting to see, 2006 was the tsunami. Now we have a hurricane.
Right.
I don't know what 2016 will be. But to a certain extent, how do you start to claim a mandate? Because with these voter turnout, I mean, we're getting these huge swings based on, say, a 40% turnout.
Right.
That means what? 23% of Americans, you know, of course, give or take, favor the Republicans. And then now they're going to go out and say the people have spoken, just like in 2006, the people have spoken, trying to take a mandate to some major changes, repealing health care. And I wonder what you think, over time, is it people just going to become completely fed up with the system because we don't know what all these other people really think. We don't know what the people think right now because the polls seem to suggest that everybody's mad at everybody, but we have to have elections. We can't come by polls.
So here's polling's problematic, right? And of course, I don't know if you saw Rasmussen, which is one of the polling organizations, as it turned out, they were 10 points off this whole election and they were skewed Republicans, so there's some question about their methodology. So even when you talk about polls, there's some question about, I tend to trust them, but there's some issues with how they're measuring. I think mandate is an elusive thing. So if we go back in history, given our low voter turnout, it is the case that, you know, FDR was actually elected by less than half of the voting age population when he had a landslide. Okay, so to a certain extent, a mandate is whether people buy that you have a mandate. Do you know what I'm saying? So Gingrich comes out in '94 and says, we've got a mandate. Bill Clinton comes out and says, I still matter, I'm the president. To a certain extent, everyone kind of bought that the Republicans had the mandate there. Does that make sense? But it wasn't necessarily that they had more or less power. Where does that mandate go in '96 when Clinton wins? It's that we bought it or we didn't buy it. I think the question there about the mandate is we're less likely to think anyone does. But that's okay. Inefficient government's what we want, right? I mean, we designed this country to be slow and inefficient on purpose. You know, and I think it's interesting. The other question about polling, you know, I've been really channeling Walter Lippmann of late, because Americans are really ticked off about the stimulus. But as it turns out, the stimulus package, or the TARP package, the bank bailout, excuse me, was paid back with an 8% interest rate. So we actually made money on it. And you tell Americans that. Why are you ticked about the bank bailout? We actually made money on that. Well, I'm still mad at the government. Well, you know, that was good. So, you know, they don't even know what policies they want. When you talk about health care, all right, so the GOP came out with its pledge to America. In 1994, it was a contract with, now it's just a pledge. And probably, you know, because they failed in the contract in '94 as well, and they had a mandate, they're probably not going to do well on this. And their health care, they are going to ensure access for patients with pre-existing conditions, which is in the current health care reform. So their pledge to America gives to Americans something the bill that they're voting on, you know, pushing to repeal actually already has. You know, healthcare is a good example on polling. When you ask Americans if they want healthcare, 48% are saying repeal it. Then you ask them all the different items, and they say yes, they want that stuff. So they don't even know what's in the bill, right? And so they're ticked about stuff that they don't know what they're talking about. So the answer on the mandate is Americans are going to be fed up, and it's their fault. Okay? I mean, they're not paying attention, or they're not kind of tracking what's happening in the news, and then they're angry about stuff. And I'm going to say that that's been the case for 220 years. You know what I'm saying? So there's really nothing new here. It's just a matter of whether someone can make people buy that they have a mandate or not. Yeah?
I really think you hit on it when you say make people buy this have a mandate or not.
Right.
When Bush was reelected in 2004, God help us, immediately, she claimed a mandate, and yet he won by a minority number.
Right.
I mean, or like 1% or something. That's hardly a mandate, except they trumpeted that mandate.
Right.
And they said, I've got this huge mandate, and
right.
I've got all this political capital I'm going to spend. And I'm going like, you're kidding, right?
Right.
But the media bought it.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe some of them did. I don't know.
Yeah. And it's a hurricane to, yeah.
I don't understand it, and I'm in the media. I don't
I think it literally is what story we're selling.
Yeah.
And, you know, for Bush, when you looked at his top advisors that were kind of in his White House staff, most of them were advertising executives before they got into politics. So, of course, the media bought it because they knew how to spin. Right? I mean, you know, but to be fair to him, there are other presidents who, you know, you do the same thing. And it's an elusive concept, right? But we do this all the time. The Supreme Court rules our lives all the time, and they have zero authority. My favorite historical example of this is where the Supreme Court said, you know, the Cherokee get to keep their land, and Andrew Jackson said, then let them come down here with their army and enforce that. And the Supreme Court kind of went, oops, we have no ability to, you know what I mean? But it's whether you buy it or not, right? Do I buy that the Supreme Court has all this authority? Most Americans do, mostly because they don't know what the Supreme Court does, so they say they must be smart and brilliant, so yes, they're good. And then we run with it, right? And to a certain extent, I think it's your fault, right? It's the media who allows that spinning to, you know, kind of dictate. Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
The Democrats, their whole plan for this midterm election, because they've been like preparing for this since they started saying the Republicans are going to win it.
Right.
The Democrats' big plan is, okay, America, now we can blame the Republicans for everything that happens in the next 2 years.
Right.
Are they still going to be able to do that since they lost the House but won the Senate? Are they going to be able to blame the
Sure. No, what happens now is it gets really fun. Okay? Because when the Democrats have all three, then there's nowhere to blame. Although Democrats are going to think they're right and Republicans are going to think they're wrong anyway. Okay? When it is split the way that it is, then you just, and then it's who you think, based on your party ID, is blame-worthy. Do you know what I'm saying? So what I've heard, to a certain extent, I think Obama's kind of happy about this outcome because now he can run as a president in divided government, and that usually helps the president a little, you know what I mean? Helps him in his positioning publicly a little bit. I'm okay with divided government. When we look at legislation that comes out, it's not that divided government stops everything, it actually slows it down, which I'm okay with, and also usually makes it more deliberative. Does that make sense? So what we find when we look at divided government, the legislation still is important legislation, more likely to be tasseled about a lot more. So all of that is okay. But here is the deal, okay? And I'll explain this. For me, it's all about party ID. Vietnam War is going on, and it happens over a Democratic president and a Republican president. The day Nixon became Republican, or no, he was always Republican. The day Nixon became president, Democrats were against the war more than Republicans were. And no shift in policy, we had done nothing different, it was just who the party president was. When you talk about the economy, we have a 9.6 unemployment rate. When Obama is president, Democrats think that's not so bad, and Republicans think it's awful. If you have a Republican president, it switches. And that's a fact. I mean, it's empirical data, right? Like, you know, it is the case that it is the case. So the party ID is going to predict a lot that blame, who I think is blameworthy, more than other things.
So Democrats are going to be happy they can blame Republicans. Republicans are happy that they won the House. Everybody's happy.
Well, yeah.
In theory.
Everyone is spinning how they got to spin, right? So when Boehner is saying, when they're going to him, aren't you partying hard? Not in California where they turned down marijuana, right? Okay, so but they're saying to Boehner, aren't you having a big party tonight? And Boehner says, no, because President Obama sets the agenda. He's already set the tone.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to blame him for everything that's wrong. Obama's going to blame us for everything that's wrong. The Senate's going to kind of sit in the middle and try to mediate this, which they do anyway. That's their job. And it just gets fun to watch. Yeah.
You said the voter turnout was higher when the races were competitive.
Correct.
But one of the strategies, of course, is for parties to make the races less competitive. So everybody is pretty gleeful that there are Republican governors and Republican legislatures in states who can now redistrict to make sure that no Democrat can ever be elected. Would you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure. Let me also say that Democrats are gleeful in the states where they hold it to get rid of Republicans, right? So let's face it, right? Yeah.
No. I mean, we've been gerrymandering this for 200 years. So.
Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of point too when you think about Texas, because everyone was ticked off about the Republicans in Texas. When you read this story real quick is, it's a fun political soap opera. They decide to redistrict. the Democrats, to refuse them a quorum, moved to Colorado and hid in a Motel 6, right? So they called out the national, they're trying to find them, to bring them back to redistrict. And part of the reason why they were so ticked off was because the Texas district lines had been drawn after 1990 when the Democrats had done well. So actually in a state that was mostly Republican, Democrats were overrepresented that whole decade. So even in the Texas case, when you look back at the history, Republicans are so, mean to Democrats because the Democrats had been so kind of mean going back. And this is an interesting question. But again, we get the term gerrymander from 1813. So interesting, that was 200 years ago when they started screwing each other using redistricting. State legislatures draw the lines. Jim Matheson, and this is, the Trib is saying 50% and 49% is what he won by?
I heard 51.
Okay, so it's
47.
tight, yeah. So he's hoping they redistrict and give him back Salt Lake. Maybe they'll just give him back that little circle so he can just run and not maybe lose next time. So yeah, and it happens every 10 years. And states that will lose seats, will hurt probably Democrats. The states that gains, those Republican legislatures are going to draw in such a way to protect their incumbents and try to get more Republicans. And you can do it. Plans can be drawn to do it, and they've done it forever, and the Supreme Court's okay with it.
Yeah.
So.
And we're okay with it, clearly.
Yeah, or we don't understand it.
Well, that's probably it.
Right, so you teach students about gerrymandering, and they're always like, this is horrifyingly awful and evil and wrong. Okay, then you try to do an initiative to make the gerrymandering here in this state to be a nonpartisan commission, and we can't get it going. Do you know what I'm saying? So, and state legislators, I think, also, they're protecting themselves. So it's not the parties as much, that just happens to be the label that they have, but it's, even if the Republicans in Utah were called something else, they would still be protecting Bishop. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? It's kind of more, protect the people whose policies agree with me most, yeah. Any other questions? No? Yeah, okay.
I was going to ask, California, they had a proposition where they would create a commission, a nonpartisan commission to do the redistricting. Do you see that catching on in other states, or if not, why?
Okay, so that's a good question. I don't know the answer to whether they passed it or not.
Right.
I was looking to see if I had those numbers, and I don't. And we tried to do it here, and we couldn't get it onto the ballot. And so the answer here kind of is, and again, it's one of information. If people understand how redistricting works, they get outraged. Get enough understanding and outrage, then it gets salience. The issue becomes something that has traction. And then maybe we get initiatives in the western states. The eastern states don't have that. Okay, western states think people are really smart and let them put stuff on the ballot. The eastern states say, no, okay, we don't vote on policy on the ballot, that's not going to happen. So I don't see it really moving in the eastern states unless there's a serious kind of wave for it. The other problem with redistricting as a thing to get really angry about is it's not that sexy. It doesn't build a bridge in my district. You know what I mean? It doesn't really do anything tangible to me or for me. So it's hard to get that salience and traction. In Utah, it's an obvious because we have this ridiculous gerrymander. So there's some salience around it because of that. A lot of states, not so obvious, although there's some pretty funny district lines drawn, right? And so I'm not sure how much of a wave there is for that. I mean, if you think about it, if we go back to the turn of the 20th century, and there's kind of this wave to make senators elected directly by the people, that's a more obvious, abstract concept, but kind of more obviously understood by Americans. Does that make sense? Who should be in charge of choosing senators, the state legislatures or the people? It's an easier sell to say the people. Does that make, you know what I mean? People are going to buy that more. But redistricting, who should draw, I mean, now you can see what I'm talking about. You kind of go down this rabbit hole of trying to figure out what is going on, and most people don't understand it. So, but if it's going to come from anywhere, it'll be the western states first, like us in California.
You just brought up a point that I'm still finding really perplexing.
Okay.
And that's the move that the Tea Party talked about embracing, and there are probably other folks who embrace it, but the idea of going back to the states.
State legislatures choosing senators?
Yes. What was that move about?
Because if you think state senators have gone to D.C. and then become something other than they're supposed to be, then one way to check that would be require them to answer to the state legislature. And Americans think and I think wrongly, okay, that the state legislature is a much better defender of their freedoms than the federal government is. Okay?
There's no evidence for that.
That that's true, or in fact there's evidence to suggest it's
Exactly.
not true. But Americans think that. It's close. Do you know what I mean? It's closer to them. And that's, you know, it's kind of a classic kind of Rousseauian argument, right? So to a certain extent, the Tea Party is tapping into small communities should be doing the governing. So you want to take the senator back to the state legislature because they will check that power of the federal government better. And Utah offers resolutions in the state legislature for this. What we want is Hatch and now Lee to come back and answer to us because they are going off there not treating Utah well. I don't think they're right. Does that make sense? I don't think there's evidence for that, but that's kind of that impetus, yeah. So they don't see it as moving away from popular control. Even though when we switched to that, we saw it as moving toward popular control. Yeah?
How is the war in Afghanistan and military spending impacted by this election, do you think, since it was such a non-issue?
You mean a non-issue in that no one talked about it when they ran?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure it impacts anything. 54% of people who voted yesterday said they disapproved of the war in Afghanistan. But Republicans are not a party that don't fight war, okay? In this pledge to America, the Republicans say, fully fund missile defense, require tough sanctions against Iran, and enforce the border. So I think we're going to war with Iran if the Republicans get control of foreign policy. I don't think it really affects it. Obama's doing what he does. I think a lot of people are disappointed in what he's doing. But the people who are disappointed by that are his own party. Does that make sense? So it changes really nothing about the way he's making his calculations. So it's not the top issue, you know. So when you say it's a non-issue, to a certain extent, you are right. When we ask America what's the most important issue, 62% said the economy. So to a certain extent, the war in Afghanistan is a totally different sphere of governing. It's foreign policy. And obviously Americans care most about domestic policy.
But there's a huge price. People tend not to think about how much it costs.
Yeah, we totally disconnect that.
We want lower taxes, we want to balance the budget, if you don't want to touch
Oh yeah, we're full of crap, right? So what we do is we say we want lower taxes, but don't cut my services. Cut her services. My services got to keep coming, but get rid of hers. Yeah. Yeah. The next biggest important issue was healthcare at 18%. And the people who picked healthcare voted for the Democrats. So to a certain extent, the war in Afghanistan doesn't really matter. It's domestic issues that people are talking about. It's domestic issues that Obama's going to make his case for in 2012. And you know, and it's an interesting thing too when you say that. Famous story out of Reagan's administration, where his budget director comes in and says, we're going to have a huge deficit if we fund the military the way that you want. And Reagan basically said, the military and the budget have nothing to do with each other. Don't talk to me about that. And the answer kind of is, oh yeah, it does. You know, it does. So, and we bought that lie 30 years ago. We're going to keep buying that lie as well. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you foresee any changes with Republicans winning the House?
Wholesale kind of changes? No. I think what's going to happen is there'll be changes in the conversation. Meaning, what we find with divided government like this is that the deliberation over particular bills happens more. Does that make sense? And you have to listen more. So on healthcare, they're not going to achieve a repeal. They're just not going to do it, okay? But they're probably going to achieve some changes. They're looking for medical malpractice reform. So things that they wanted to add in that the Democrats wouldn't add in, those kind of things are going to change, but they're going to be little changes. Does that make sense? I don't think there's going to be some major shift in the way we handle domestic policies. And the tax cuts will be an interesting conversation, right? That kind of round, they're going to say tax cuts for everybody. Americans are kind of more in favor with tax cuts for people under $250,000, which they already have, but they don't know that they have, so you know, who cares what they think because they're not paying attention. So I'm not sure on that, whether the wealthy are going to get their tax cuts extended. Does that make sense? Things like that are going to change the way that we do little policy, but it's not the case that everything is going to shift hugely. And in terms of leadership, it doesn't even look like the Republican leadership is going to change at all. The interesting conversation in the Senate is whether the Democrats bump Harry Reid. So his argument is, I just fought a really hard campaign, so I know how to do this for 2012. And the Democrats might say, no. You know, no. And And then it is Dick Durbin should be next, but Chuck Schumer out of New York is fighting. So the question now is, Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid are good friends. So there's a leadership battle brewing, but it's unclear that these two men will battle with each other. Does that make sense? But in terms of policy, huge shifts in the way that we do things, I don't see major change happening. Incremental changes that are better for Republicans, yes, but not huge changes. Anything else? Yeah.
During these elections, you see a lot of the mudslinging in certain campaigns. Does your data ever show that that affects a certain demographic?
Sure.
And discourages them to vote?
Sure. So your question is about negative campaigning,
Yes.
right? Okay. And the answer on negative campaigning is we don't know the answer because no one's never used it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in terms of a variable, it's in every campaign. Okay, so you can't.
Vary from
Yeah, but once you go mudslinging, it's hard to then. What's level of mudslinging? Do you know what I'm saying? One of the candidates was being called Taliban Dan, in Michigan. So you kind of went where. So how do we decide? And so we can't figure it out. The other answer is the 2004 Democratic primary season had no negative ads, and it had the highest turnout for primary. So we kind of say with that anecdotal evidence, if we didn't do negative campaigning, more people would engage. So we think that negative campaigning turns people off. But because all general elections have negative campaigns, we can't figure out if it wouldn't help. And everyone's afraid to call the bluff. You know what I'm saying? I'm not going to be the campaign that doesn't go negative if maybe I'm going to lose. So we think that it depresses turnout. It is the reason when we ask people why they don't vote, they will cite cynicism and they claim it's from negative advertising. Does that make sense? So it is the reason people say that they don't turn out, but we don't know for sure if we got rid of it, if we would cause turnout to be higher. Does that make sense? Because we can't compare cases because all the cases have it. Any other questions? Did you like my triple negative sentence there? I hope that made any sense at all, but go ahead.
I said, in retrospect, what could the Tea Party have done differently to have more of a success this election? And then also, what are they going to have a resurgence in 2012?
So my answer is I think they're not a new thing. They're Republicans. So to be successful, for the Tea Party to be successful, it would have had to run its own candidates against Republicans and beat them. Does that make sense? If we're going to kind of talk about the Tea Party becoming a force that becomes institutionalized in our country's history, in the way that forces become institutionalized in our country's history, they'd have to do that. They didn't. They ran in nominating cycles. And they were very effective there. Okay, they bumped people in nominating cycles. But they ran as Republicans. Does that make sense? So if they're going to gain traction, they need to move outside of, which they're not going to want to, okay? They're on the right side of their party. To win elections, they kind of got to move, who are they going to grab? Do you know what I'm saying? Like they've got to grab some more people to become a bigger force, and they're already kind of inside of a different group. Does that make, you know what I'm saying? So it is either the case that the Republicans absorb the Tea Party, which is what it looks like is happening, or it's the case that the Republicans get absorbed into the Tea Party, which doesn't look like it's happening. So how can they do better in the next term? They should run their own candidates. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like what they want to do is if they really want to run the table, they've got to run their own candidates to govern. Because then you have things like Rand Paul in Kentucky, who ran as a Tea Party candidate, and then when he got the nomination said, Heisman Trophy, kind of on, the Heisman stance from the Tea Party. Actually, as it turns out, So it's hard. Was he a Tea Party candidate? I don't know. Because when he ran in that general election, he stepped away from it. Rubio down in Florida stepped hugely away. Now they're claiming it's a Tea Party victory, but when he ran that general election, he wasn't talking Tea Party. So when I said at the beginning, I need to figure this out, there's some research here. Does that make sense? Ferreting out which campaigns actually use Tea Party language and then actually won. So the answer is if they want to do better, they need to not get folded into the Republican Party. Which hurts them, because then the Republican Party would split and the Democrats win. So it's and that's worse, right? You'd rather have a Republican who at least looks conservative than liberal. So, you know what I mean? It's going to be interesting to see how they figure that out. And I think what you're seeing today, and I heard last night, let me just make sure I get his name correctly, Kevin McCarthy was chatting about, he's a Republican whip, chatting about how do we deal with this and what issue. You can see the Republicans very carefully going, and they asked, I can't remember if it was McConnell or Cantor, I can't remember which leader they talked to, and they said, how about Tea Party? You're going to put all those pledges in? And he kind of said, we're going to discuss that. I mean, he really evaded it. So they got to figure that out. So if the Tea Party wants to be successful, they need to run their own candidates. Yeah?
Do you think the Tea Party is really a they?
No.
I mean, because they don't seem any different than the folks that elected in 94. All those seem to be the same demographics, the same people that put in those conservative Republicans in 94. They just didn't have a great name.
Right.
And if I don't remember them. I mean, the Tea Parties they had a couple gatherings around some media figures. I can't remember if that was true in 94 or not. So I just wonder if it's just.
I don't think it's a they.
2010.
No, right. I think it's the conservatives in the Republican Party who gave themselves a name. Because when you look at them, they are white, wealthy, educated. Okay? They are identifying. None of them. And it was interesting. At the beginning, we weren't sure. Because it was fun to watch to say, wow, this could be a whole new movement. But as it turns out, they're just Republicans. I don't mean that, but you know what I mean? As it turns out, they're not different from Republicans. And what was interesting about them is they're not necessarily Christian. Okay? Not to say they're Muslim, but I mean, half of them said, I don't really know if the Bible is literally true. So what was interesting about the Tea Party movement is it's not the evangelical Christian movement. Does that make sense? So to a certain extent, it's a new power base in the Republican Party that looks a little different, but I think it's still Republicans. They voted for Gingrich 20 years ago. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's still the same people. Yeah.
But don't you really think that the Tea Party did have a big effect on this election? Because the way it started out was, let's evict everybody out of their office and let's put some new players in there. And that's what it started out as.
Yeah, but I don't think so. I think they had a major effect on Republican nominations across the country. But once those people were nominated, they ran as Republicans. So what I'm trying to say is, we got to ferret that out. Mike Lee is the Tea Party candidate, but he's the Republican candidate in Utah. I don't know how different he is from Bridgewater. Do you see what I'm trying to say? I got to know, did he actually run on Tea Party candidates? And like I said right at the beginning, there's research to figure that out. And I got to do that research. Okay? Thank you very much.